Very good evening to you. Welcome to the Lent Course. As you will have gathered, we can't be together physically, but because I'd already put the materials together for this, and because we have the technology to do it, I thought it would be good to try and present the material to you so that you can watch this if you're interested. Obviously, it won't be quite as good as our being together and having those wonderful conversations around the tables, but nevertheless I've put this together, and I'm going to try and leave you some space to think about the questions. You might be able to do that in your house with others if you live with anybody else, or you might just want to do that on your own, and we can still hopefully gain some benefit from all this. So we're on session 3, which is called Historical Differences. And the aim of this session is really to look at how Holy Communion has been seen differently throughout the history of the Church. And it's important because it's not just us with our Bibles trying to work out how we should do Holy Communion. There have been many people throughout history who have wrestled with these things, and we stand on their shoulders. And so it's important to locate ourselves within that map of Christian history. So to help us do this, I wanted to do something perhaps a little bit more interesting than just a history lecture. So this evening I welcome you to join me in my time machine, and we are going to visit 3 different Holy Communion services at 3 different dates in Christian history. And each time I'm going to describe what you're seeing. And I'd like you to just sit back and enjoy and imagine what I'm describing, and take note of anything that jumps out at you. So the first place we're going to get in our TARDIS and go is Italy in the year 200. And we find ourselves in a large cave, the so-called catacombs. And we see before us a small gathering of Christians sat around a table, eating a meal. And the meal is sort of akin to the Passover meal that we looked at a couple of weeks ago. They're all reclining around a table. There's clearly a man who is in charge of proceedings. And in some ways it just looks like an ordinary meal, but there are also some ritual components to it. There are certain prayers recited at certain times in the meal. The man who's in charge of the meal isn't dressed like a priest. He's not dressed any differently to anyone else, but he is clearly in charge. And there are certain components of Christian worship that we would recognise as part of the meal. There is singing of the Psalms. There are readings from the Scriptures and the writings of the Apostles. There is a time of confessing sins and getting right with others in the community, what we might call the peace. We notice that there aren't really any set words used by the person who's in charge. When it comes to the bread and the wine, the main bit of communion, there is a kind of Eucharistic prayer, but it's not a set prayer. The man presiding seems to make the words up. And yet there are some common words that we would recognise. The words that Jesus used when he instituted the Last Supper. The other thing we notice is that this is quite a select and private gathering. Everyone who's there receives the bread and the wine, but no one is allowed to be there unless they have gone through a great deal of initiation first. You have to have been catechized, you have to have gone through a long period of being a catechumen, which is like a trainee Christian, before you're then baptised and admitted to this secretive meal, the Lord's Supper. And it's so secretive, in fact, that rumours went around in the early church that these Christians were cannibals, because no one had ever been to one of their gatherings without being a Christian. And these Christians talked about eating body and drinking blood. So that's our first visit. So if you've got a pen or paper, you might want to pause the video and write down what strikes you as interesting, And also have a think and write down, what do you think the Eucharist is about to these people? If you'd ask them what's Holy Communion all about, what would they say? Now, hopefully you've had time to think about those two questions. What is communion about to people in the early church, people who met in the way we've just witnessed? I think it's about fellowship, it's obviously about a meal, and it's about participation. Everyone joins in. So perhaps the primary idea for people in the early church around communion is that it's a fellowship meal. The bread that is broken in communion represents the people. It's the body of Christ. And of course the body of Christ is also a phrase that is used to describe the people of the church. And so there's a sense in which the bread that is broken, the one bread, represents the one body, the one people who are gathering to eat this meal. But the early church combined this sense of it being a fellowship meal that we all participate in with a very high view of the importance of this meal, a very mysterious view about it. When you read early church writers talking about Holy Communion, they sometimes sound like they believe in transubstantiation, like they're Roman Catholics. And it's because they use such lofty terms for talking about this great mystery. But unlike transubstantiation, which we will look at a little bit later, they don't have a very specific view of how it works, what happens to the bread and the wine. It's just they talk about this meal in really very lofty terms. They talk about it as a great mystery, a thing that they should have great reverence for. And we see that as well in the fact that you're only allowed to be a part of it if you are a part of this community, if you've been initiated in. So that is our first trip to the early church